To discuss the goals and strategies of the movement, we are joined by Public Relations Officer for the PNP Women's Movement, Patricia Duncan Sutherland. Good evening.
Good evening, Pastor. Good evening, Oliver. Good to be here.
Outstanding to have you. I'm curious. I've read the communique which has been put out. Do we not already have laws on the books that address the situation? So is it a matter of enforcement, or do we need additional legislation?
Well, we have some legislation that needs to be passed. The Sexual Harassment Act needs to be passed and needs to be reviewed. Right now, in its current state, it only addresses sexual harassment in the workplace. We believe it really needs to address sexual harassment in public spaces as well, as a precursor to general violence against women, as well as offenses against the Persons Act, Domestic Violence Act, the Child Care and Protection Act, because a lot of the abuse that we are seeing is also against young girls, to look at how we can introduce clauses into these acts to ensure we can have evidence-based prosecution in the context that where a victim is really not feeling brave enough to come forward, that where evidence presents itself, as evidence presented itself in two videos. One included a very public figure, and one included used with a woman attacking a man. How can we prosecute so that we can use that as part of our prevention tool?
What are mayors going to do about legislation, though?
That's legislation. The legislation needs to allow for it.
Yes, but you're asking mayors
it
to...
can happen easily, and that a victim can easily go forward and cause this, or not a victim, somebody who is witness to it, or if it is public, it can be easily dealt with from the office of the DPP or from the police.
Yeah, but the question I was asking is, what have mayors and minority leaders have to do with legislation?
No, well, mayors and minority leaders, in the fight against gender-based violence, everybody's voice needs to be there, and there's other roles to be played. There is how are we going to use the community development arm of the local government structure to help us to get that conversation going between men and women at the community level. It's an important, you can't change legislation without effecting legislation on the ground and making legislation mean something. Changing a law alone won't change the way that women and men relate to each other in Jamaica. At the core of this is how we relate, and so therefore there's going to need to be training, there's going to need to be funding for that kind of training to ensure that we can do the full change required to cause gender-based violence for Jamaica not to feature in it. Right now, we are second in femicides in the world.
I understand your point, but my question to you, to circle back to what my co-host just asked, when it comes to minority leader, first of all, given the amount of seats, the meager amount of seats that the opposition has in Parliament, could it not be said that this is little more than virtue signaling to shame the party leader to do something which he literally has no power over at this point?
No, sharing with mayors and minority leaders, of both parties. For us, gender-based violence is not a PNP thing, and it's not a JLP thing. We happen to be one of the voices. Today, we joined with the Institute of Gender Studies in this protest. They organized this protest today, Thursday, in black, and we added our voices to amplify this protest today as well, as part of the amplification process. Michael Abrams has put out his voice in this regard. Some churches have come out in this regard. There was a church in Spalding today who came out and stood against it today as well. This is about all of Jamaica understanding this is all of Jamaica's problem, and we have to work together. PNP, JLP, church, councillors, MPs, all of us have to come together if we are going to solve this violence problem in Jamaica. And it's not the problem of gender-based violence
if I may,
Jamaica.
Is it possible to legislate behavior? Because at this point, given the laws that Jamaica has on the books, regardless of the ones that you would like to see added to the legislative agenda, we have these laws, nothing has been done, we still have the issue. Is it possible to actually legislate societal behavior, or do we need to start somewhere else?
which is why the engagement of the councillors. Because councillors have a particular role to play in community engagement. There's also SDC that has another role to play in community engagement. And then there's the Minister of Health that would have that role as well. And there's the Minister of Education that has another role. So the councillors are playing the role now as the community people who are engaging on the ground to help us with that change in behavior. Because when you have a legislation coming over here, for the legislation to be effective, the people need to understand the legislation, and they also need to choose a different behavior that works with the legislation. So you can't just make the law in Jamaica, so we're going past Sexual Harassment Act, that won't solve sexual harassment. It's going to take more than that. And so it needs all hands on deck. It needs councillors, it needs MPs, it needs SDC, it needs a church, it needs US Gender Studies Department as they are stepping up, it needs JFJ, it needs everybody putting their hand, it needs the police also to understand. So how we get that funding into place so we can do that kind of public education, but it can't, pointless to the public education if your legislation does not support it. So both have to work hand in hand.
Patricia Duncan Sullivan, thank you for joining us this evening.